Imagine a machine conceived not for convenience, not for commuting, but for the singular purpose of translating raw racing intent into something a civilian could legally straddle. An object born in paddocks and engineering labs, then forced to masquerade among license plates and traffic lights. Picture metal shaped to chase lap times, tuned to answer throttle inputs with razor-edge precision, yet expected to idle at stoplights and tolerate potholes. Think of the tension baked into every bolt when designers try to serve two masters, the unforgiving world of competition and the mundane demands of public roads. That clash of purpose, race pedigree against street practicality, creates legends, but only when the stakes, resources, and timing align just right. And when they do, the result isn't just a motorcycle. It's an engineering statement that rewrites expectations for everyone watching. If you're into stories where ambition meets asphalt and obsession becomes something you can actually buy, hit like and subscribe, then drop a comment with the next machine you want covered. The Honda RC30 didn't appear in a vacuum. It emerged from a corporate mindset shaped by decades of racing ambition and a desire to legitimize competition technology on public roads. And to understand how that happened, you have to go back to the environment Honda created for itself in the 1980s, long before the model rolled into showrooms. The company had already proven it could dominate circuits across the globe, but internal leadership believed that engineering victories meant more when they translated into something tangible that enthusiasts could own, ride, and feel proud of. That mindset collided with regulatory demands, cost structures, and consumer expectations. Yet Honda pushed forward because the RC30 was never meant to be just another motorcycle. It was a statement produced at a time when homologation rules gave manufacturers an excuse to build exotic machines in relatively small batches under the guise of production models. The development process revolved around questions other manufacturers avoided, like how to incorporate gear-driven cams in a street-legal engine, how to justify hand-finished components in a consumer product, and how to persuade executives that this approach would elevate brand image far more than a high-volume release. The cultural tone within Honda's R&D teams leaned toward obsessive precision. Engineers who had cut their teeth on Grand Prix projects were asked to contribute the same intensity to a model that would technically need to meet emissions requirements and durability standards. That tension between the demands of racing and realities of the street shaped every major decision on the RC30's path. The design intent was rooted in endurance racing, where reliability, power delivery, and quick serviceability mattered more than creature comforts. As a result, components like the single-sided swing arm weren't installed for show, but for the practical advantage of faster wheel changes during competition. In a typical motorcycle project aimed at everyday riders, cost and ease of manufacturing usually define the early planning stages. But here, performance parameters dictated the blueprint, and cost control trailed behind as an afterthought. At the time, Honda executives believed that carrying over the credibility of the RVF endurance racers would pay dividends in global prestige, particularly in markets where riders cared about authenticity over price tags. The RC30's V4 engine configuration wasn't chosen for novelty. It reflected a lineage that Honda had refined and trusted in competitive environments because of its balance of torque, power, and compact packaging. That said, converting a racing-oriented V4 into something acceptable to government inspectors and dealership service departments wasn't straightforward. Engineers grappled with noise restrictions, fuel delivery quirks, and the need to make the bike tractable at low speeds without dulling its upper range ferocity. To make matters more complicated, the project launched during a period of growing protectionist policies in some regions and shifting emissions regulations in others. So every market introduction required tweaks and recalibrations that had to preserve the soul of the machine. Meanwhile, inside Honda's walls, there was a sense that building something this specialized could reinforce employee pride and remind younger engineers why the company's legacy mattered. Morale and identity were on the line as much as sales forecasts. The production process reflected that mentality. Instead of relying solely on automated assembly lines, Honda allocated space for more meticulous, hands-on assembly procedures where tolerances were checked by seasoned technicians. This wasn't a move that boosted efficiency, but it preserved the integrity of the concept and ensured the final product embodied the spirit of the racing division. When the first prototype units began circulating among test riders, the feedback loop was intense and often unflinching. Riders reported sensations that resembled their experiences on track machines: responsive throttle, aggressive braking, and chassis behavior tuned for precise cornering, and Honda adjusted accordingly rather than toning things down for mass appeal. At this stage, the question wasn't whether the RC30 would fit the mold of a typical street model. It was whether the world would recognize its purpose once it debuted in dealerships. Some in the company wondered if customers would appreciate the quieter gestures of engineering, like the use of lightweight materials in places most riders might never see, or the careful balancing of rotating internals to reduce vibration. Yet those decisions aligned perfectly with the core intent: to let any owner, in theory, experience a slice of Honda's racing pedigree without signing up for a pit crew. The internal culture celebrated the RC30's progress as an embodiment of the company's philosophy. But leadership also knew that marketing would need to frame the bike as premium without alienating potential buyers who didn't speak the language of lap times and homologation. In that environment, the RC30's concept came alive as both a passion project and a strategic tool to reinforce Honda's global reputation for engineering excellence. What began as a bold idea in a climate of competition turned into a handcrafted machine that straddled the line between race shop and showroom floor, and the groundwork laid by its creators would shape everything that happened when it finally reached the public. That's where the real test began, because once the RC30 left the factory, it had to prove its worth to riders, journalists, and regulators in a world that wasn't built around racing priorities, and the reception it received would determine if Honda's gamble paid off or became a cautionary tale, setting the stage for how the bike confronted expectations. In markets far beyond the engineering labs where it was born, the Honda RC30 entered the public arena with expectations that hovered between skepticism and awe. And from the moment journalists and early adopters got their hands on it, the conversation shifted from curiosity to reverence. Reviewers marveled at how a machine designed with endurance racing priorities could behave so predictably on winding roads. They highlighted the chassis balance, the throttle response, and the braking setup as evidence that the engineering team had refused to compromise where it mattered most. Riders accustomed to conventional sport motorcycles quickly realized the RC30 demanded skill and rewarded precision, which added to its mystique but also limited its appeal to those who wanted everyday usability without effort. Yet the exclusivity only enhanced its image. Ownership felt like membership in an elite circle rather than a practical purchase. In the US market, distribution numbers were modest by design, partly because the bike's price far exceeded what typical riders expected to spend, and partly because Honda didn't need high volume to justify its existence. The model was a homologation tool first, a consumer product second. Enthusiasts who managed to acquire one often treated it less like personal transportation and more like a collectible artifact built to be preserved or selectively unleashed on track days. As attention grew, aftermarket specialists saw an opportunity to expand on what Honda had created. Some focused on suspension tuning or exhaust refinements to maximize performance within racing classes, while others experimented with cosmetic tweaks, though purists resisted changes that might dilute the bike's identity. Meanwhile, privateer racers capitalized on the platform's reliability and adaptability, entering regional events not just to win, but to showcase what a near race-spec bike could achieve in the hands of a skilled rider. The RC30's presence in competition validated Honda's initial purpose. It wasn't simply street legal, it was track-ready in a way that few contemporaries could match. Rival manufacturers took note, but none could immediately replicate the formula because it required a level of resource investment and philosophical commitment that didn't align with mass-market strategies. In certain regions, regulatory nuances influenced the bike's configuration. For example, emissions constraints in some markets led to minor detuning, though the core experience remained unmistakable. Owners learned to navigate quirks like tall first-gear ratios, firm suspension, and maintenance routines more reminiscent of a track machine than a commuter bike. Yet those very quirks became points of pride among fans, proof that the RC30 was built with a different set of values than mainstream options. Over time, its presence in clubs, shows, and enthusiast meetups created a cultural gravity that kept the legend alive even as newer machines claimed higher horsepower or better electronics. Those who rode it in anger at closed-course events appreciated how manageable the power delivery felt, especially when compared to the more unpredictable behavior of tuned inline-4 engines of the period. The bike inspired confidence through its structural rigidity and feedback, making it a popular choice among racers who understood that outright power wasn't the only path to lap time dominance. Meanwhile, street riders drawn by its reputation had to adjust expectations. The RC30 didn't cater to comfort or convenience, and long-distance travel often highlighted its uncompromising nature. Still, the rarity and engineering pedigree overshadowed any practical shortcomings, and its resale value reflected intense demand among collectors. Some markets saw prices hover well above MSRP, even while the model was still in limited circulation, signaling that buyers recognized its future significance. Critics who initially questioned the value proposition began to acknowledge that the RC30 wasn't trying to justify itself through features or versatility. It existed to set a standard. That perception helped shape how enthusiasts compared other high-performance motorcycles that followed, establishing criteria that prioritized authenticity over volume production. As regulatory landscapes evolved in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the RC30's existence became a reference point in debates about what manufacturers could realistically achieve under street-legal constraints. And Honda's success made it difficult for competitors to argue that regulations were the limiting factor. In the context of global motorcycle culture, the RC30 also served as a unifying topic among fans of endurance racing, mechanical craftsmanship, and limited production models. Conversations about its strengths championed exacting build quality, while critiques focused on accessibility and cost. But both sides agreed it changed how people talked about performance bikes. That influence set the tone for how the RC30 would be remembered and compared as the next era of technology-driven superbikes emerged, hinting at a legacy that would stretch well beyond the production years and into the realm of icon status. The Honda RC30 closed its production run with a reputation that only grew stronger as time passed. And understanding why it mattered requires looking at what lasting mark it left on engineering philosophy, enthusiast communities, and the broader landscape of performance motorcycles. Within Honda, the RC30 demonstrated that a limited-run machine could elevate the company's brand identity more effectively than a high-volume release, proving that engineering ambition could coexist with commercial pragmatism if the product aligned with racing goals. That lesson informed subsequent projects and encouraged the development of other homologation models that carried the aura of exclusivity and capability. Among enthusiasts, the RC30 became a benchmark not merely for its technology, but for how cohesive and intentional it felt from end to end. Nothing appeared decorative or unnecessary, and every choice reflected a racing-first mindset adapted just enough to satisfy legal requirements. Owners and mechanics who worked with the bike long after production ended discovered that its build quality held up in ways that validated Honda's investment in precision manufacturing. The availability of parts eventually became a challenge, yet those who maintained the RC30 saw value in preserving something that carried tangible historical weight. Collectors recognized early on that the bike's scarcity and pedigree would translate into long-term desirability, and auction results decades later confirmed that instinct. In the context of racing, the RC30 left behind a blueprint for how manufacturers could approach homologation efforts. Build something so fundamentally capable that only minimal alterations would be needed for competition. Then let results on the track justify the production strategy. That approach influenced how other companies navigated racing rules and production quotas, even if they couldn't fully replicate the resources or corporate will that Honda committed to the RC30. For riders who encountered it in person, the machine offered a tactile connection to an era where mechanical engineering carried the narrative rather than electronics or software. That experience shaped the tastes of future collectors and builders who pursued restoration projects or sought out unmodified examples to safeguard. The RC30 faded from showrooms but expanded in influence, becoming a reference point in discussions about authenticity and brand heritage. Even modern motorcycles that boast advanced rider aids and carbon fiber components are often measured against the clarity of purpose the RC30 embodied. As enthusiasts look back on the late 1980s and early 1990s, this model stands out not because it tried to please everyone, but because it embraced limitation as a form of identity, hand-built elements, specialized parts, and uncompromising geometry. For those tracking investment value, the RC30's appreciation creates both an opportunity and a barrier. Since owning one now often means entering a level of commitment reserved for serious collectors rather than casual riders. Yet that exclusivity only reinforces its legend. Today, spotting an RC30 at a gathering or vintage event is enough to draw interest from people who understand the bike's lineage. And conversations around it tend to center on its purity of intent rather than nostalgia alone. The legacy isn't just about historical relevance, it's about how a motorcycle can encapsulate a philosophy and transmitted across decades without needing reinvention. As the industry continues to evolve, the RC30 remains a reminder that meaningful impact doesn't require mass appeal, only conviction in execution and timing. The final measure of its success isn't just in trophies or auction prices, but in how often it still enters conversations when riders debate the greatest performance machines ever made. A sign that its influence hasn't dimmed even as technology and tastes have shifted. That legacy draws a line from the past to the present, challenging modern manufacturers to prove that passion and purpose can still drive innovation even when market realities seem to pull in the opposite direction. The Honda RC30 continues to shape conversations among American enthusiasts who weigh heritage, cost, and practicality when considering rare performance machines, and anyone looking to own one today needs to understand both the realities and rewards of chasing a motorcycle built with racing DNA rather than everyday convenience. In the United States, availability hinges on a mix of private sales, specialized importers, and collectors who occasionally release well-preserved examples, and even then, prices reflect a market that values provenance and condition over accessibility. Expect to see asking figures that place the RC30 firmly in investment territory, especially for low-mileage or historically documented units. Maintenance presents another layer of commitment because sourcing OEM parts often requires patience and networking with international suppliers or enthusiast groups. While the bike's engineering is durable, the age and rarity of certain components make routine service more complex than with modern sport bikes. Still, reliability isn't a major concern when upkeep is handled by knowledgeable mechanics. And owners often find the mechanical simplicity, relative to today's electronics-heavy models, rewarding to preserve. Riders who dream of using an RC30 for regular street duty should recognize its ergonomics and gearing cater more to spirited riding than commuting. And insurance classifications may vary depending on its collectible status and declared usage. For those interested in track events, some owners maintain separate bodywork or exhaust setups to protect original parts, and vintage racing classes occasionally provide a legal, structured outlet to experience the bike's capabilities without risking irreplaceable components. Collectors who don't plan to ride their machines often treat the RC30 as part of a broader portfolio of homologation icons, showcasing how this model still influences perceptions of authenticity and engineering purity. From an investment perspective, values have steadily climbed across US and European markets as supply tightens and awareness grows, reinforcing the belief that this motorcycle represents more than a nostalgic footnote. It's a benchmark whose importance continues to mature. For viewers weighing whether to hunt one down, the key takeaway is that ownership comes with responsibility as much as bragging rights, and importing or buying domestically requires diligence with documentation, VN verification, and service history. Yet the payoff is clear. The RC30 offers a direct connection to an era when a manufacturer poured racing expertise into a street chassis with little concern for mass appeal. Its influence on later performance motorcycles shows up not just in design cues, but in how high-end models justify their existence today. As new technology reshapes how bikes perform and communicate with riders, the RC30 endures because it represents intent unfiltered by compromise. And in a world crowded with options, that kind of clarity remains irresistible to anyone who understands what ambition on two wheels can really look like. Sometimes, one machine built for a purpose can echo longer than 1,000 built for the masses.